Alright, so here we go into the skeletal system. I'm going to try to go through this fairly quickly because there's quite a few slides here and I know you don't want to watch this for like 45 minutes. So here we go. First term, orthopedics. That is the medical profession which deals with the preservation, restoration of the skeletal system. Articulations, which is the joints and associated structures. So basically, if you go to an orthopedic, that is somebody that you go to if you have some sort of problem with your bones. So for example, me with my arthritis in my hips, my hip joint, I have to go to an orthopedic in order to find out what's wrong and eventually to fix it. Osteology is the study of bone structure and the treatment of bone disorders. Know that your skeleton, your bones are dynamic and they're ever changing. So depending on how active you are, your bones are constantly rebuilding themselves. They're being made up and they're also being torn down. And the skeleton is composed of many different types of tissues. Of course, cartilage, the bone tissue, epithelium, nerves. You're not going to need to know all that, and we're going to go over all that later, so let's move on. And now the functions of the skeletal system. Bones in the skeletal system. Once again, usually whenever you see functions of something, that usually turns into a written or short answer question for your exam, so I would definitely write these things down. And the first one is support. So your skeletal system and your bones help support your body. So, all of your muscle, most of your skeletal muscle attaches to bone. So without those bones, you wouldn't be able to stand up. If you're all muscle and no bone, you need those bones in order to support the rest of your body. Protection, especially things like your rib cage. Those are what protects your lungs and your heart. So bones help to protect your body and your organs from injury. Movement is another one. Even though it's muscles which are initiating or making the movement, it would not be really possible to move like we do unless those muscles were attached to bones. Your skeletal system also serves as a mineral storage, mainly calcium and phosphate. So calcium, I believe the skeletal system stores about 99% of the calcium in your body. Now, calcium is obviously important to help you build strong bones, but also it's important because your neurons, a lot of them, they have calcium channels. So those neurons, if you remember from the nervous system, require one of the ions it needs are calcium ions. Number 5, blood cell production. It's called hemopoiesis. That is the production or the making of blood cells. It occurs in the bone marrow, specifically red bone marrow. So this is where your red blood cells, like these guys, are made. Most of your white blood cells, which are for like immunity, if you get sick, they help fight the disease. And also these things called platelets, which help your blood to clot if you get a cut and you start bleeding. It's platelets that stop you from bleeding. And a little lesser importance, but number 6, chemical energy storage. So in your yellow bone marrow, you have triglycerides, which are like fat, and that those triglycerides can be broken down to form glucose, which can be used for energy in the body. All right, so now the parts or the anatomy of long bones. Remember, these are bones that are longer than they are wider. So right here you will have what looks like the femur. And the first part is called the epiphysis. And those are the ends. So you can see this is called the proximal epiphysis. That means it's closer to the middle of your body. So that's like where your hip would join right there. And this is the distal epiphysis. So that's further away from your torso or your body. And this is where your kneecap would be right there. So there's 2. It's both ends of the long bones make up the epiphysis. The next part is called the metaphysis. And those are in between. So it's in between the epiphysis and what's called the diaphysis. So here's the metaphysis down here, this region right there. And then up here, here's the metaphysis. And it contains, this part right here is called the epiphyseal line. That's in adults. But it's also called the epiphyseal plate, and you also hear it called the growth plate. So the epiphyseal plate, or the growth plate, that's where the bones get longer. So once you're full grown, that epiphyseal plate seals off and you no longer can get taller. Or your long bones can no longer get longer. They still remodel, they still replace that bone tissue, but the bone will not get longer once you're an adult and that epiphyseal plate gets sealed off. The next part is called the endosteum, and that is like the innermost lining. So this is a hollow cavity right here. This is compact bone, but it's that inner lining right there containing bone-forming cells, which makes up the endosteum. The diaphysis, which I said earlier, that's the shaft, so that makes up most of the length of the bone. So this long, skinny part there, that's the diaphysis. And the last part is called the medullary cavity. And that is, anytime you hear cavity, if you have a cavity in your teeth, that means you have a hole in one of your teeth. So this cavity inside here, that would be the medullary cavity. In adults, it contains yellow bone marrow, which is a fat storage. And you can also see here, if you see here in the diaphysis, this bone right here is very solid and dense. That's called compact bone. Compact bone. If you look up here, you can see there's little holes in this bone on the distal ends, on the ends in the diaphysis and the metaphysis. Those little holes, because that's spongy bone. It's not as dense as the compact bone. All right, the last slide on the anatomy of long bones. Next section is called the periosteum. And that's kind of like a skin for your bone. It's a tough outer membrane which covers the bone. You can see it right there, the periosteum. So it's the outer covering which wraps your bone in a tough membrane. Another part is called articular cartilage. Articular cartilage. And you can see some right here. So these are found on joints. So right there, that would be where your femur attaches to your hip. And this is where since I have arthritis, all of this articular cartilage has been worn down over years and years of using it during baseball and golf, whatever. That cartilage has been worn down, so now there's nothing in between the bone of my femur and what's called the acetabulum in my hip, in my pelvis. So now it's bone rubbing against bone, which tends to hurt. And you can see some more articular cartilage on this end for this joint. This is where your tibia would connect. So that helps to prevent friction when your bones are rubbing against each other. And the last part is called the epiphyseal plate. It's called the epiphyseal line once you're an adult, and then it's also called the growth plate. So you can see it right here in the metaphysis region of long bones. So that is the area where, when you're still growing, that's where the elongation of the bone occurs. And it's a layer of hyaline cartilage. I don't think you'll need to know that. Just know that it's the growth plate, and it's located in the metaphysis region of long bones. And that's where long bones get longer. And once you're an adult, long bones don't get longer anymore. That's why you quit growing. And now a general description of what bones are actually made out of. It's a type mostly made of connective tissue with cells that are widely spaced apart. So there are cells in your bones which are secreting and creating what's called the matrix. And the matrix is made out of 25% water, 25% collagen fibers. Those are like stretchy, elastic fibers. And 50% crystallized mineral salts. Now, what are the functions? It's these salts which gives your bones their hardness and strength. The collagen fibers give it its flexibility so they don't just snap in half really easy. They can bend a little bit. And we will go over 4 types of cells in bone tissue. So if you look over here, here's an osteocyte. That is a bone cell. And each one of these little dark regions in here, all the little dark little spots you see, that's where the bone cells are located. And they secrete all of this substance. So all the lighter looking stuff, that is the bone matrix. So there's a bunch of little cells in these little dark areas, and they secrete the matrix, which makes up the vast majority of your bones. And here are 4 types of bone cells that we'll need to know. The first one are called osteogenic cells. And they say they're undifferentiated because they're kind of like stem cells, if you know what that is. They can turn into other types of cells. And mainly they will turn into osteoblasts. So these are cells that can divide, so you can make more osteogenic cells. They're found in the inner layer of the periosteum. Remember, that's like the outer skin, the tough outer layer that's found on the outside of your bones. And also that inner layer, the endosteum, which is the inner layer lines the medullary cavity, the space in your long bones. Now these osteogenic cells can become osteoblasts. And what you really need to know is these are the cells that form new bone matrix. So you remember the bone matrix made of mostly inorganic salts and water and collagen fibers. That's basically the material, the stuff that you consider bone. So when you're building new bone tissue, it's the osteoblasts that do that. You also have what's called osteocytes. Those are a different type of bone cell. These are mature cells. They cannot divide. They no longer secrete the matrix. That's the material that makes your bones nice and hard. And their function is one of their functions, they help to maintain the metabolism in your skeletal system, which is basically use the nutrients, release the wastes. Now, osteoclasts, those are the opposite of osteoblasts. So remember, osteoblasts build new bone tissue. Osteoclasts actually destroy bone tissue. So maybe that bone tissue is old, and that's called reabsorption. Or maybe your blood is low in calcium, and you need that calcium. So the osteoclast will start to break down bone tissue to release that calcium, or maybe even phosphate, into the blood, which maintains what, if you remember, homeostasis. And just for fun, here are the 4 types of bone cells, what they look like. You will not need to know how they look like. Maybe an osteocyte, I don't know, because they're like star-shaped. But the rest of them, you really can't tell much of the difference. But here's the osteogenic cells. Those are the ones that can turn in to osteoblasts. Remember, osteoblasts are what form new bone matrix. So they secrete collagen and the inorganic salts, mostly calcium, which makes your bones hard. Remember, osteocytes, that's kind of like the boss of the bone cells. They control a lot of the functions within bones, metabolism, releasing waste. They can also communicate, almost like neurons. So they have quite a few. Just know that that's like a mature bone cell, an osteocyte. And then if you remember the osteoclasts, that's the opposite of the osteoblasts. So they do not release or secrete bone matrix. They don't make new bone. They actually destroy the bone matrix. And remember, that is called resorption, because you're reabsorbing the minerals inside the bone and releasing it back into the blood. So osteoclasts break down bone tissue. Osteoblasts form new bone tissue. And the 2 general types of bone. So the first is called compact or dense bone. I always call it compact bone. And you can see that right there. So it's what makes up the shaft of long bones. It's compact because it looks really, really solid. There's very few spaces in between this compact bone. It is solid. And that's to help the stresses produced by weight and movement. That's the compact bone. Now, I thought the next slide was going to be spongy bone, but it's not. But you can see here in the epiphysis and the metaphysis, you can see that this kind of looks like a sponge right there. You can see there's little holes in it. And that's what the spongy bone is. It is not as dense as the compact bone. And moving on, now we have what's called Volkmann's canals or perforated canals. These are these are little spaces which contain like lymphatic vessels and blood vessels and some nerves, but they're transverse canals, which means, so if this was a bone like this, let me change the color. Volkmann's canals will run transverse or horizontally. So they move horizontally through the bone. Now the opposite of that are the Haversian canals. And they're the same thing. They're canals that extend through the bone, but this time they don't extend transverse or horizontally. The Haversian canals are going to extend vertically through the bone tissue. Once again, holding blood vessels, lymph vessels, and some nerves. And the next term is called a lamellae. And you're not going to really know what that is yet, but it's if you chop this bone in half and then look from the top, you would see that it's made of concentric circles like that. And those concentric rings are called lamellae. So each one of these rings, right there, that would be a lamellae. The next ring, that's a lamellae. The next ring, guess what? That's a lamellae. And this little hole in the middle, that's probably a Haversian canal that runs right in the middle of all those lamellae. The next term is called lacunae, which means little lake in, I don't know, Latin or Greek or something. And those are little tiny spaces. So let me get a different color. So inside the bone matrix, these little spaces. And you'll see them. They'll look like little dark little spots. And that's where the osteocytes are living. They live in those little spaces called the lacunae. Now the next one is canaliculi. Canaliculi. All right, so here's a little section of bone right here. You can see the periosteum, the outer tough membrane on the outside of the bone. You can see, let's get a different, I guess green will work. You can see these dark little spaces in here. Those are the lacuna or lacunae, and that's where the osteocytes are living. So these little spaces in here, that's where the bone cells, those mature bone cells are living. Now here you can see the concentric circles, like there's one, there's another one, there's another one. Remember, those are all lamellae, those concentric circles. So you can see them on this one. Here's one right there, there's one right there. Those are the lamellae. Now, all of them put together, so this entire circle, I know half of it's been cut off. Not a great color, let me switch the color, go to yellow. This entire thing right here, guess yellow's not great either, that would be an osteon. So all those concentric lamellae and the lacuna together form an osteon. Here, down here, blue's not a good color, let's go back to green. This would be a Volkmann's canal because it goes transverse or horizontally. This would be a central canal or a haversian canal because it is going, up and down or vertically. As you can see all down here, all of this that's really dense, that's the compact bone. So that makes up the shaft of long bones, and you can see out here, this is the spongy bone, because you can see there's a lot of spaces in here. And it's made up of these fibers right here, this matrix called trabeculae, but we'll go over that later. And the last slide, so let me get a good color, I think red's good. So if you see this all right here, this entire thing would be an osteon. Now you can kind of see it, but there's concentric circles. And remember, those are called the lamellae. Each one of these concentric circles, which makes up the osteon, those are the lamellae. Here you can see a central or haversian canal. Each one of these little dark spots right there, that's the lacuna. The lacuna, that's where, remember, the osteocytes are living inside those lacuna. And you can't really see the canaliculi. You barely can see them. You can see these barely little, faint little lines. Those are the canaliculi, which connect the lacuna. And eventually, so that can move nutrients and waste from one cell to the next, and eventually can take it to the haversian canal, where it can be moved throughout the bone or released from the body. All right, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.